Welcome, everybody. I'd like to begin today's discourse on the inner kingdom with this reading from Whispers from Eternity. O Spirit, beloved Father, over soul of the universe, Spirit of spirits, friend of friends, teach me the mystery of my existence. Teach me to worship Thee in breathlessness and in deathlessness. In the fire of devotion, burn away my ignorance. In the stillness of my soul, come, Spirit, come. Possess me and teach me to feel Thy immortal presence in and around me. Come, Spirit, come, come, Spirit, come. Paramahansa Yogananda used to say as we began our service a little earlier that his highest prayer, easy prayer too, is for us to repeat that prayer of his, reveal thyself as you're meditating. And as we were meditating, I was asking you to look into the darkness. What's in that darkness behind closed eyes? And this was the question that Master asked also in his autobiography. What's behind that darkness? And the scriptures say, and the yogis say, and we read in the books, that there's this inner kingdom. Seek ye first the kingdom of God. And where is that kingdom? The kingdom is said to be inside you. But I know over the years they've done many autopsies on people, and I don't think they found a kingdom inside anybody yet. And it's unlikely to. And of course we know that really we're not going to find that kingdom in this plane, this physical plane, this material plane, no matter how hard we look. And if we look inside, we won't find it. We look outside. And there's been many kings and kingdoms, but they come and they go. And we're not going to find it there as well. And so it's always said we have to look. But where is that kingdom? And of course people think, well, of course, it's just an allegory. It's not really, it's just a metaphor, or it's an image that is literary, you might say. But the yogis have said that that's not so. There is a reality to that inner kingdom. And it reminds me of that story that, remember that, and you've all heard this story, or I'm sure 95% of you have, that story of how when Yogananda went to America, in Boston. He had been there for a couple of months, and he met what was to become one of his first disciples, Dr. Lewis, who was a dentist. And Dr. Lewis was a skeptical man. He was a man of science, training, dentist training, medical dentistry, and he was skeptical of spirituality. He had been brought up in a Christian tradition, but he said, what are people talking about? It didn't make sense. It seemed to be somewhat more a little bit of too much belief, but no substance to it. And so he was very skeptical-minded, but yet a very inquiring soul. And he came up, his path crossed that of Yogananda. And on Christmas Eve of that year of 2020, he arranged an appointment with Yogananda and went up to his apartments where he was staying at that time in Boston. And he began for an interview, and Yogananda, of course, was very gracious to him and accepted him and said, how can I help you? What would you like? Perhaps you'd like to ask a question. And Dr. Lewis asked him this question. He says, I've read the Bible. Probably many times he had read the Bible. He had studied the Bible. It's much more traditional in those days than these in that part of the country. And he said, I've read the Bible, and I've always wondered about this phrase in the Bible, and I've asked it many times of teachers, but nobody seems to be able to answer it. Perhaps you could answer it. And it says in the Bible, if thine eye be single, thy whole body will be full of light. Can you tell me what that's about? And Yogananda said, I think so. And he says, well, tell me. And now I'll shorten the story. There's more to it that went after that. But eventually, Yogananda then sat before Dr. Lewis, and he put his forehead up against Dr. Lewis's forehead. Now, this was their first meeting, so you can imagine it was probably a little startling to the doctor at the first meeting to have this foreign fellow put his head up against yours. But he was curious, and so he put his head up, and Doctor began to see there in his forehead a great light began to appear. And it became stronger and stronger and stronger. And pretty soon he began to see this illumination of great divine light to the spiritual eye, and ultimately also of the thousand-petal lotus at the Sahasrara. And he was put into a state of deep ecstasy in seeing of that light. And from that point forward, there was no need to be convinced by Scripture. No need to be convinced by other people reading something, because he had experienced for himself what it meant of that inner kingdom that was inside of himself. And I think this is what all of us are here today. We've been told these truths, and we too are like Dr. Lewis. We want to be able to experience that for ourselves, because we live in an age where we're no longer satisfied. We're no longer satisfied with mere reading about these things and being told about these things. We want to know for ourselves, and that's the age within which we live. And this has been predicted by the great masters, and this is what Swami Sri Yukteswar had told Master, and what Master has passed on to us, that in this age, it's the age of experiment. It's the age of science, and we want to know for ourselves. Now, when this week, I've been here this week since Tuesday, and we were having lunch one day, and some of the volunteers here, we were talking, and I mentioned something to them I'd like to repeat, is that when I was young, you know how it is when you're young, when you're a little kid, you don't think too much about these sorts of things, but when you start to come up to 11, 12, 13, you start to think a little bit more seriously. And it was with me. I began to inquire. I began to look around and ask, what is this world all about? What's going on here? And I began to notice something that I was interested in. I began to be interested in things that my friends were no longer interested in. They wanted to do all the typical things that teenage boys like to do, but I was not interested. And I found myself drifting apart and feeling very isolated a little bit. I wanted to be part of the group, as most kids do, young people do, but I found that I was a foreigner, in a sense, in that way. I was outside. I wasn't part of that anymore because I had other ideas. Now, I went along as best I could, but of course, because you're a young person and you want to be part of it. But I just felt very much outside because there was something else. I just knew it. There was something else. This world cannot be like this. It was, but I was in that confused state. I suspect some of you have looking back at those years, they're confusing years. You're trying to figure out what is your life about, and what's this life around us about. But I had this sense of aloneness because nobody else seemed to be asking these questions. Of course, then I thought, well, when I go to college, of course, then everything will change. But it didn't. I still began to ask, and I was still alone. Until I read the Autobiography of Yogi. And I read that book, and I was so excited because I recognized in that book, here was somebody who understood the questions that I was asking. And it gave me a sense of hope. My God, there's something more to this world than just this run-of-the-mill material existence that didn't seem to have any meaning for me. And all of a sudden, I felt so uplifted because here was something that was possible. And I said, maybe, and he was speaking, of course, of an inner kingdom, maybe there is something more behind this. And that impelled me and propelled me. And I came upon one paragraph there at the end of one of the chapters that moved me quite a bit and motivated me, and I'd like to read it to you. Perhaps some of you remember this as well. But for me, it spurred me on because I was not a joiner or a believer, or I was a skeptic and outside of most traditional things. And it says this is the end of one of the chapter on Lahiri Mahashai, and Master in this paragraph is speaking about Lahiri Mahashai. And he says, new hope for new men. Divine union, the Yogavatar proclaimed, is possible through self-effort and is not dependent on theological beliefs or on the arbitrary will of a cosmic dictator. Through use of the Kriya Key, persons who cannot bring themselves to believe in the divinity of any man will behold at last the full divinity of their own selves. And that described me so perfectly. Couldn't believe in anybody. But yet, it was giving a key. If you don't want to do, fine. Find out for yourselves. And that's it. Now, if you read that closely, though, you'll see there's a catch. There's a little but, as there is in so many things. It's great, but, and that was that word self-effort. Were you willing? Was I willing? Was I willing to put in self-effort in there? But yet, nevertheless, the keys were in my hands if I was willing to use them. And I think this is something that we need to take away from this when we speak about the inner kingdom. That inner kingdom is there. It's within each one of us. But yet the keys to it are in our hands. There's a phrase in the Bible, ask and it will be given. Seek and you will find. Knock and it will be opened unto you. But you see, what is it saying? It's saying, you have to do it. You have to be the one. You have to ask. You have to seek. You have to knock. It's not going to happen unless that happens first. And the first thing, of course, is we have to ask. We have to begin. When our hearts, and even at that time, although I didn't realize it, I was going in life, my heart actually was asking, what's this all about? And I suspect, I didn't think of it in terms of an asking, but my heart was going out. And I read something a little bit later that from the book Holy Science, a few years after I became interested in these teachings and read Master's work, I read the Holy Science, and Sri Yukteswar says something very interesting in there. He says, in the age that out of which we've come, Kali Yuga, that people in that age, they see this world as the ultimate reality. The end-all and the be-all of everything is this very physical world of matter. And they accept that, and they conform to it. He says, but in the age that we are entering into a time when people begin to question whether that's true or not. They begin to ask. They begin to ask a question. Is there not something more to this world? Now, they're not necessarily asking literally, but their heart is asking. There's got to be something more, which is where I was at, and I suspect many of you also, your heart was asking that there must be something more to this world than that. Especially when you're young, you ask these questions. And those people that ask that, Swami Sri Yukteswar says, they begin to ask and broadcast that message. They begin to get glimpses of something more tantalizing, spurring them on, whetting their appetite. And little by little, those glimpses begin to attract those people to seek. And they begin to look more and more and more. And as they begin to seek, eventually they begin to find. And they begin to be revealed. And what happens, he says, these people, those that are truly seekers, they ultimately begin to attract to themselves the keys, the methods, and the guru, of course, that will ultimately lead them to the answers that they're seeking. And this is ultimately going to lead them to making the search for those answers, for that truth, the motivating factor of their life, where it becomes the most important thing for them. And for me, that was true. Everything else was secondary when I came to that realization, that point in my life where this is what I want. I want to know the truth of what this reality is all about. And I think when Krishna speaks in the Bhagavad Gita, 1 in 1,000 seeks me, those are who he's speaking of. Those people who have come to that point in their life when that's what they want. Because we looked at the statistics, many people love Krishna, but how many really seek? How many are willing to dedicate their lives to seeking that answer? And that's what's being called for to us, each one of us, is to make that the string by which we pick up our life. And when we do that, answers begin to come. Knock, and it will be opened unto you. Now yesterday we were having a meditation, and I used this image of the idea of knocking. When Sri Yukteswar goes on to explain that there is an inner kingdom, literally, for all of us. It's inside of us, so it's not in this material world. And there is a way to enter into that kingdom. Do we know what it is? There's a doorway. He calls it the Sushumna Dwara, the door into the Sushumna. Where is that doorway located? It's right here, the spiritual eye. And he says, when you learn to enter in and seek and focus your attention and present yourself at that doorway, this is the path of Kriya Yoga. And we have been given the keys to the kingdom to be able to find our way to that doorway. Now, in the Bible, there's a saying in the Bible that Christ says, or Jesus says to Peter, to you I give the keys to the kingdom, or to you I give the keys. And what Master interpreted that to mean, Paramahansa Yogananda interpreted that to mean, is to you I give the techniques to be able to approach that gate, that door. And that technique of Kriya is what we've been given to be able to approach that doorway, that Sushumna Dwara. And when we get to a doorway, what is it that we do? Now, this one is you could try using the key, of course, but what if that's latched? The key turns the lock, but you still can't get into that door. What is it that you do when you get to a door? It's not opening. You knock. You knock. But how do you knock? That's the question. And do you knock and you go tap, 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 hoping that somebody will hear you? Well, you could do it that way. But if you're just tap, tap, tapping, maybe nobody's going to hear you. You have to catch their attention. So you have to get to that doorway. We have to get to that doorway. And when we get there, what do? We have to make it heard. And if necessary, pound on that doorway to call the attention of the master of the palace at whose door we're standing. And in a deeper sense, that's our home. You might say that we left long time ago, got lost, finally found our way back, but the door's locked, it's closed, and we've got to rouse the master inside that to open the door because his child is back. And that's our position in this life, is to those who seek, they'll find. To those who knock, it will be open. But we have to call the attention of the master of the castle to come to that door, to open that door. But we're his children. And this is what, of course, he will recognize, and that door will be opened. The prodigal child, you might say, has returned. And that inner kingdom is there for all of us. We, putting this into our terms of our practice of Kriya Yoga, we have to gather our forces. We have to ask, we have to interiorize those forces and raise those forces up to the spiritual eye. And when we have done that, we have to, with the deepest of devotion, come, Master, come, Divine, come. And with that calling of our heart, that door to that inner kingdom will begin to open, and we can enter into that. And you'll find that this is true, and that light will begin to shine, just as it did for Dr. Lewis. And little by little, you begin to discover what's behind the darkness of those closed eyes. But it takes our effort. Now, some of you are going to stay for a little bit afterwards. We have a class after the service is over, or the satsang's over, and we'll take a break. And we're going to come back, and I'd like to go into this a little bit more for those of you interested in staying. There's a play, because we have to knock, and we have to put 100% effort in there. But there's also, we can demand, but it has to be a loving demand, because it's God's grace that ultimately also comes into play. So the practice in this reading, I was reading from the Autobiography of Yogi, we've been given these keys, and it's in our hands to be whether we choose to use those keys, whether we choose to use the techniques that have been given to us. And the opportunity that has been presented to us at this time in this age is immense. And I urge all of you, don't let the opportunity pass you by. Because the karma that has been given to us to be able to be here right now, in the presence of the vibrations of these great masters, this is not something to be taken lightly. Because the gurus come from age to age, it's true. But our karma is such that it's very easy to get drawn away into other directions. That was once Swami Kriyananda asked Master, why is it people come? They come and then they're very sincere, but then they get drawn away to something else. And he said, they come, but then desires arise, circumstances draw them away, and they forget. And off they go. I've mentioned this to some of you before, as Swamiji was asked that question also of some of the students of Swami asked him, why is it sometimes people come and they're very sincere, but then all of a sudden they go? And he said, well, it's their karma that has brought them into the orbit of the great masters, into the orbit of the teachings. And he says that's very good karma from past lives. And that karma awakens and it spurs people on. He says, but unless a person invests that karma, it runs out. Like an inheritance, you might say, where we inherited this good karma from our actions in past lives. But unless you invest that inheritance and just spend it, it runs out. And he says, when the karma runs out, something else will come into their life and off they go. And so when I heard him say that, I thought, oh, God. It frightened me a little bit because it made me introspect. Am I investing or am I spending? And I think we want to ask ourselves that. Are we investing? The time we've been given an opportunity. I think to myself, I spent many years living at Ananda Village, an ashram, beautiful ashram in the countryside. But no matter how beautiful something is, pretty soon you don't pay it attention after a while. You don't even see it after a while. And it's just a nice place. And then I think, oh my God, years are going by and I'm wasting this time. I need to right now. And of course, some of us are getting on in a little bit of years. You look and you say, no, I don't want to waste time. I've got a limited, and all of us, have a limited amount of time, but we've been given such a beautiful opportunity. And the rewards for that, we've been given the keys to the kingdom, that inner kingdom, and we have them. And it took a lot of good karma for us to get to that point where they've been given to us. Now let's use them. Let's use those keys. We've got the opportunity, we've got the venue, we've got the place, we've got the people that can help us. I started that story saying I felt very alone when I was seeking before I read the autobiography. Interesting that once I read the autobiography, I said yes, and I began to meet other people that had exactly this. I thought I was alone. Of course, a young person, a teenager, has no perspective. And then I began to realize, other people felt this way too. Did any of you feel that way? You growing up and you felt nobody seemed to understand what you were interested in. And then you realize you start to meet others. And as we begin to evolve in that way, our spiritual lives begins to grow, we begin to attract other people who have those same interests. And here we have such a beautiful sangha of people, that one helping the other. So let's join our forces. Take the opportunity that has been presented to us to be able to go deep into these teachings now, because who knows what tomorrow brings. So make use of the opportunity that has been given to us now. And that inner kingdom, like Dr. Lewis discovered in the story, that inner kingdom will be opened up and revealed to each one of us. And you'll see, through the grace of the gurus will draw you into that kingdom and reveal it to you. Practice, 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 and you'll see it's a truth. Many, many blessings to you.